Hello and welcome to another Respond Billing webinar training video. My name is Jeremy Johnson, again coming to you from TriTech Software Systems, representing the Respond Billing product. And today we are going to talk about prior authorization and the new functions that come with our version 5.13 for prior authorization. So let's start with a couple definitions. First off, what is prior authorization? Well, there's part of a story behind that. CMS has currently implemented prior authorization requirements in several states, and those requirements are set to go nationwide sometime in 2017. So this is something that some are dealing with now and everyone will have to deal with in the future. But prior authorization is the way that you can track repetitive, non-emergent transports that had been authorized prior to the fact for some of your payers. So payers will allow you this prior authorization to run these transports. So currently what's happening in 5.12 is that prior authorization is tracked on the call questionnaire tab. So the prior authorization number is simply a question in the call questionnaire tab, and you would answer this question and insert the authorization number that you received from your payer. Now, this is a fine way to get the information to populate on your 1500 forms and in your electronic files, but as many of you may know, and the rest of you will soon find out, prior authorizations are date and charge specific. And so the current functionalities of version 5.12 do not allow for any of that sort of tracking or customization for these prior authorizations. You can't really tell the system exactly what it's for or when it's going to be valid. So in 5.13, we've added new functionalities to more properly and more thoroughly track and manage prior authorizations. This call questionnaire item is going to remain in version 5.13 so that legacy information can come into the updated version and that information has a place to land. But going forward, we'll be using the different functions that version 5.13 includes. And so today, we're going to have a sneak peek of that updated prior authorization functionality. So where does prior authorization begin? Well, the first place it begins is on your payer, because you receive prior authorizations from your payer. So I'm going to bring up a payer here, and this is the payer we'll be working with to input this prior authorization today. On the payer code is this prior authorization tab. Select that tab, and within this area is where you will input the information that you receive from your payer as to what they will allow. So they're going to tell you we're going to allow a maximum number of 60 days. This prior authorization is going to be valid for this particular time period. So you're going to input the number of days that it's valid there, and then the number of trips that they will authorize as their maximum number of trips. Now these two first bits of information don't really have an impact on the functionality of the system, but it's good for you to track what you receive from your payer. The grace days do have an impact as to when prior authorizations are going to be no longer valid or no longer applicable to a particular call. So the grace number of days is the maximum number of days in which transports must occur in order for them to be considered repetitive. The payer gets to decide what that number is, and they're going to provide that number for you in the prior authorization. So this payer says that the trips have to occur within 5 days for them to be repetitive. So that's another nod back to the basic definition of prior authorization, is that it's repetitive, non-emergent transports that are pre-authorized by the payer. The grace number of trips. How many trips will it take in the definition of this payer for them to be considered repetitive and fall within prior authorization? This payer looks like they said it's got to be at least 2 trips. So the grace number of trips is the number that they specify minus 1. So it's got to be above this number for it to qualify for prior authorization. And then the final piece of the puzzle down here are the HCPCs that will be available to be selected for your prior authorization. Remember, they're date specific and they're charge specific. So in this case, we've got both the ALS and the BLS HCPCs included in this prior authorization. Now let's just say you inputted those in here and you realized, oh, you know what, they're not going to authorize ALS. I need to simply include the BLS HCPCs. So I can simply select the A0426 for ALS and delete that one. It'll ask me if I'm okay with that, and then it simply lists the A0428. You want to add a new HIC pick, simple enough to click New, select from the drop-down, and you can put it back in there once you accept it to the grid. Once you've set up your payer code with the prior authorization information that you got from the payer, make sure to save, and then you'll have that information ready to apply to the patient and then be able to interact with that on the call. So from that point, we need to go to the patient, because remember, prior authorizations are stored on the patient now in version 5.13. They're no longer stored on the call, but they're stored on the patient. And that makes sense because it's an authorization for a series of patient transports, not just a single transport. So we go to the patient. So I'm going to bring up the patient in question that we're working with today. In this patient, you'll see there's a new, or additions to the tab here. We've got a PCS/prior auth tab. We're going to bring up that tab, and this is where you're going to see the list of all the prior authorizations that either are currently active or you can show inactive prior authorizations here. Well, let's start out building our first prior authorization. So you click the Edit button. You have to select prior auth up here on the top radio button so it knows the type of input that you're offering here. And this is where you can start the process. Now you can use this process to track both when you requested the prior auth from a payer and then when you received it and they gave you the green light. So it defaults to today's date for the requested date. So for today's purposes, I'm simply going to leave that there. And then you put in the effective dates that the payer provided for you. So for today's example, I'm going to put in April 1st and run that for 60 days. So I'm going to run that to the end of May then. So again, these are the dates provided to you by the payer. We will authorize transports within this time frame. What type of a prior authorization request is this? Have we expedited it with the payer? Is it the initial time? Are we resubmitting? Perhaps the last prior auth expired and we need to submit for a new one. In this case, I'm simply going to hit initial. This is just for your tracking purposes. It doesn't impact the functionality of the prior auth in the system. The next field does. What service is the payer authorizing? So in our payer code setup, we selected both of these HIC picks to be included in the prior authorization. For this particular one, I'm simply going to select the BLS HIC pick. Now, what status is our prior authorization in? You can put in a requested prior auth. As soon as you want to request it, you can build it here into the patient and then send the request off to the payer and then simply wait until they get back in touch with you. Now for today's example, we're going to pretend they already sent us back an approval and mark it approved. Big note with this one. If the status is not listed as approved, your prior authorization will not be available on the call. It won't be available to be used, so it has to read approved rather than requested. Which payer is putting in this prior authorization? The payer code that I worked on was the Medicare payer, so I'm going to make sure I select the proper payer for that. How many transports did they authorize? Get that right off of the prior auth that they provided for you. Now the next field is pickup, and then it's shortly followed by drop-off location. Some payers will not give you any information for locations. They won't make the prior authorization location specific, but some will. Keep in mind, if you put in locations in the pickup and drop-off location, they must match the locations on the call in order for this prior authorization to be used on the call. For now, I'm simply going to leave the pickup and drop-off locations blank so we can see how it works. Prior authorization number, I'm just going to put in test, and that's going to be a number that will come on that prior authorization from the payer. So you're going to want to put in the number that they provided so you can track what they have and haven't given you over time. So I built my prior authorization. I'm going to accept that to the grid. It appears up here, and then I'm going to hit OK. And it will now appear in this grid on the patient. Be sure to save that information. And so now we've got, if I bring that back up on the patient side, go back to the PCS Prior Auth tab, we can see our prior authorization is listed right here. Now, if you've got a series of prior auths, perhaps you've been working with this payer over a long period of time, getting these prior authorizations for transport, you may have a whole list of inactive prior auths. you can see those here by just clicking that button. So you can see the whole list of everything that you've worked with on their behalf for this patient in the past. So we've got our payer code set up, we've got our patient set up. Now we can go to the call and work with this prior authorization. So I'm going to bring up the call and start working there. When you are looking at the call, you have to verify that your information from the call and from the prior auth match up. So hopping back over here, we'll bring up this prior auth screen a little bit to the side and be able to look at some of those details. So my call date, 5/1, falls within this date range. So I'm good there. My current payer and my primary payer on the call are both Medicare, so I'm good there. I'm going to cancel out of this after you see that it's an A0428, and I can see that over here on my charges, A0428 is the BLS base rate charge that was input on this call. So all of my details match up. Medicare, call date, charges, I'm all set. Where do I select my prior authorization? That now lives on the Claim Status tab. So you're going to select your Claim Status tab, and you're going to try to bring up a prior authorization, because you're going to see this button down here and you're going to click it. And you're suddenly going to be very disappointed because you've got an empty list and you're going to be wondering why. Well, there's several reasons why that might be the case. One of them is the information on the call doesn't match the prior authorization, whether it's the HCPC or the date range, or the prior authorization is in requested and not approved status. In this case, it's actually a more simple explanation. You've got private pay selected in your list of payers. You have to actually select the payer that you're working with in order to see whatever prior authorization is available. And once you select the proper payer, you can see that our test prior auth is available. And once you populate that, it's going to show up here in the authorization number grid on this screen. So at that point, I'm going to save that entry to make sure that my call now has the appropriate prior authorization on it. We can see that listed here. So we verified all that information to make sure that our prior auth that we built from the payer code to the patient can now be input on the call. Now, let's just say that you come to the call and you want to select a prior authorization and your field is empty. You're going to want to verify what's going on with that and what may have happened that has caused that to not add up. So in this case, we've got a BLS call 5/1 for Medicare. We can come back over here to the patient and look at this prior authorization. And let's just say we change this A0428 to a 426. We're going to save that on the patient. I'm going to refresh the call. And if I go to the Claim Status tab, I'm going to see this test listed here because that's the previous entry. Okay, so it's going to have that sort of legacy data listed there. But if I select the Medicare payer and try to find a prior authorization, there will be nothing listed. And that is because the HCPC on the call and the HCPC on the prior authorization do not match. So that's one of the ways where you're going to run into those kind of problems. Another way you could run into that is if you make your prior authorization location specific. Now we're going to just input in here that we picked this individual up at the residence. And I know that the call that we're working with is a drop-off location of Abbott Northwestern Hospital. But we're just going to select Allen Hospital in here just to show you how this works. And I'm going to switch this service back to the BLS base rate because I know that's what's on the call that we're working with. So I made some changes here. I'm going to accept those changes, hit OK, make sure to save the patient. I can come over here and refresh my call. On my Claim Status tab, I'm going to select my Medicare payer. I'm going to see the old data there, and I'm going to try to put on a new prior auth, and it's not there. That is because over here on my Billing tab, my Locations tab, excuse me, I've got a pickup location of residence and a drop-off of Abbott Northwestern, and that is not what's listed on this prior authorization. I've got Allen Hospital here. So you can see there's several different ways that things will not work out for you if you don't have them adding up correctly. So I'm simply going to remove these locations. I'm going to show you also here requested. So if I accept that as this is now a requested prior authorization, refresh my call, come back to my claim status tab, select Medicare, and I still have no options there. Without an approved prior authorization, you're simply not going to have the option to attach anything to that call. If I come back over to the prior auth, change this to approved, accept, OK, and save, refresh my call. On my claim status tab for the Medicare payer, I will now have this authorization. So it even populated in there because it knew it was valid for this call. So the prior authorization function is here to help you track these types of requests and these types of authorizations that are going to become an increasing part of your life as a biller for these repetitive, non-emergent transports. They are built from the payer code on the prior authorization tab. That's step one, to select your days and trip numbers and HCPCS as given to you by the payer. And then they are built from there onto the patient, where you input the date range that they've authorized, the status of the prior auth, the authorized HCPCS, and then if your payer specifies locations, you can input those there. And then from there, that stored prior authorization on the patient can be applied to the call itself. Now, what happens if you made a mistake on the call? Let's follow that possibility here. Let's say you've got this call set up here, you've got your prior authorization on it, you're thinking everything is all set, but then you realize you put in the wrong charge. So we're going to edit this, and I'm going to reverse this base rate charge and add the ALS base rate charge. So I've got the HCPCS now of A0426, which is accepted by my payer, if you remember how we set up the payer, but it is not listed on the prior authorization built onto the patient. So let's see what happens here. I'm going to accept that change to my charges, and then I'm going to save the call, and the system is going to give me a moment to pause. One or more prior authorizations are now invalid for this call, and it's going to tell me which prior authorization it is. There are no other valid choices to choose from. Do you want to delete it or not? So the system is telling you you've made a change to the call that causes it to no longer agree with and be able to utilize the prior authorization. So you can see that there's some checks and balances and some good helpful reminders built into the system here to keep your prior authorizations working properly. So I'm simply going to say no to deleting that, and I'll bring up my call again here. Switch out my charges. And accept that, and from there I will have no problem saving. So you saw when I clicked save, there was no error message that popped up here stating that my prior authorization and my call were no longer in agreement. So the moral of our story for today is that version 5.13 is going to provide you some excellent new ways to track prior authorizations on your system, both when they are requested and when they are approved, and it will help you assign them properly from the patient to the call in particular that is authorized for that prior authorization. So I thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to call our support line. Thank you also for being part of the TriTech family, and have a great rest.